Today on BRStv, we're gonna get fish in this tank. Hi guys, my name is Ryan. Welcome to another week of the BRS 160, where every week we do our best to help you guys, members of the reefing community, enjoy your tanks and find new ways to explore the hobby. We do that by following the setup and progression of this 160-gallon reef tank. Today we're going to talk fish, not just how to select your first fish, but how to build a fish plan, quarantine options, acclimating your fish, a high-level look at feeding, and then show you what we selected as the first fish for the BRS 160. There are all kinds of things to consider when you're stocking the tank. You really need to consider the must-haves first and work your way back from there. For instance, if an eel or lionfish are just something you have to have, it's probably going to have to be a dwarf species of lion or dwarf golden moray so they don't eat your fish. Even then, you're probably ruling out smaller fish, shrimp, or crabs. In fact, if you really like shrimp and crabs, there's a whole host of fish like many wrasses and hawkfish who are basically off limits. If you really want a mandarin at some point, you'll need to skip fish like a Coris wrasse, which will likely outcompete it for food. The first part of the plan is really about the size and how many fish for your tank. As size is concerned, most fish stores or online vendors will be able to tell you pretty easy if the fish is an appropriate size for your tank. Keep in mind, this advice is generally on the liberal side and should really be considered a maximum. There's one big exception to that rule. If you're willing to give the fish back to the store when it gets too big or trade it with someone you know, there's no reason you can't put a juvenile fish in a tank which is smaller than an adult version would live in. In fact, within a couple years it takes to outgrow the tank, you might even upgrade to a larger tank. A yellow tang is a good example of that. I personally have no issues with putting a small yellow tang in a 60-gallon cube or 70-gallon tank. If you start fairly small, it'll likely be years before it outgrows the tank, and it's normally pretty easy to find homes for a healthy tang. Just make sure it isn't a species that it doesn't grow disproportionately fast, and try not to be reckless, but you can bend the rules if it's part of a long-term plan and the health of the fish is part of that plan. There are a ton of rules out there about how many fish you can add, which are decent guidelines, but not many reefers follow them religiously. Most of us really want as many fish as possible, but every fish you add generally increases the need for water changes and potential for nutrient issues like algae growth. Too many fish, especially of the same type, also reduces potential habitat and increases competition for food sources. When you're making your fish plan, consider the amount of available habitat. There's 3 basic areas in the tank: sand dwellers like gobies, fish who like to perch on surfaces like hawkfish, and fish that like to spend most of their time in open water like tangs, chromis, and anthias. Try to spread the fish you select over the various habitats available in your aquascape. It's also wise to try to avoid fish which are going to outcompete each other for food, like the Coris wrasse and mandarin, or aggressive about food sources like tangs which graze on the rock for algae. The first wave of fish should be fairly hardy species. If the fish is labeled expert only or costs $500, it's also probably a poor choice. Ideally, your first fish should not require a ton of food for a couple of reasons. First, because the tank's biological filtration really isn't stable yet, even with ideal cycling. Second, because food turns into nutrients, which can feed algae growth common with new tanks, which is obviously something we'd like to avoid. Fish from the damsel family are more tolerant of new tanks and potential ammonia spikes, which make them ideal for a newer reefer who has little experience with properly cycling a tank. The most popular damselfish, of course, is the clownfish, and something that almost every new reefer ends up with. Anytime you add fish, make sure to monitor your ammonia levels. A really good rule of thumb is to never more than double your fish or food load in a single month, which if followed will likely help you avoid ammonia-related issues. If you'd like to be really in touch with your biological filtration, the impacts of adding that new fish, that Sanite monitor we talked about a couple weeks ago, among other things, will help provide real-time ammonia readings and email you anytime things are off track. That first wave of fish, or shortly after, is a good time to add your more timid fish that can really benefit from not being bothered while they establish some territory. Shrimp and goby pairs, clown gobies, dartfish, blennies, and basslets are some good examples. The next wave of fish is generally fish that serve a purpose in newer tanks, primarily those that eat algae or pests common in new tanks. A lot more blennies, rabbitfish, or maybe a dwarf angel if you're willing to risk it nipping at corals later. Next, I'd add anything you don't consider aggressive to other fish and you want to add to the tank. Chromis or anthia schools, reef-safe wrasses, some hawkfish, really anything from your tank's fish plan that isn't aggressive. After that, it's time for aggressive fish that will actively go after territory, protect food sources, and attack similar species in the tank. Tangs are probably the biggest example of this. It's just a good idea to always add aggressive fish last. This way, the more timid fish have already established their territory and it'll be less stressful for them. This is even more important if you plan on adding multiple aggressive fish, like a few tanks to the same tank. You're way more likely to have success if you add them at the same time. This is especially true of tanks from the same species family. If you add them at separate times, the chances of the first one attacking the second one later are pretty high. In my experience, as long as the tank is appropriately sized, there's a stable food supply, and they're added together as juveniles, the chances of multiple tanks getting along are pretty good. In many cases, a school of 3 to 5 in a large tank will do better than 2 because it allows a chance to diffuse the aggression. This is also the case with our office clown harem tank. 3 or 4 clowns added at separate times almost always ends in disaster. However, adding 30 at a juvenile state combined with proper habitat and a stable food source has been a recipe for success. A harem like this will always have a somewhat aggressive nature to it as they squabble for dominance, but it's diffused and typically not focused on a single individual. Last wave of fish are those that require established systems to have high survival rates. Mandarin gobies and sand-sifting gobies are good examples of this because both require developed and sustainable microfauna populations to have good survival rates. Once you've selected your fish, it's time to discuss one of the more hotly debated topics, quarantining your fish. Fact is, fish come with all kinds of diseases and parasites on them, and if you stay in the hobby long enough, the chances you'll run into one is fairly high. There are 2 basic types of quarantine systems. The first is more or less just an observation tank. Easiest way to set this up is to keep a sponge or some filtration media like marine pure in the sump. When you need it to set up your quarantine tank, remove the media and add it to your quarantine system. This will likely keep the ammonia in check, but you should absolutely test it daily for the first week or so to make sure. If you happen to have something like the Senai, I would personally take it off my main tank and put it on the quarantine system during this time. More or less just observe the tank for a month or so, and if you don't see any signs of disease or parasites, add the fish to the tank. The second quarantine system is designed to treat fish with medications like copper, regardless of the signs of disease. Often starts with a freshwater or medicated dip, which will cause many parasites to release on their own, and then weeks to a month in the medicated tank to ensure the fish is safe for the tank. The nature of this type of quarantine makes it obviously much more successful than a simple observation. Here's where the debate comes in. Well, quarantining your fish is obviously a good idea from the perspective of preventing the introduction of disease to the tank. Throwing a fish into an unstable tank that was often just set up with low salinity or full of harsh medications also has its own mortality issues. There's obviously a learning curve to designing, setting up, and maintaining a quarantine system properly, so some fish will likely die that would have otherwise made it if they've been added directly to a healthy, stable tank. And like any other best practice, there's often budgetary and space constraints that might prevent success. If you don't have the space or budget, that about sums it up. Even if you do have the budget, is this the best place to put your time and resources? You could argue all day on the merits of an aquarium control or a quarantine system being the best expenditure of money to protect your system or home. End of the day, my advice is best practice says you should quarantine. Every type of fish is best served with a different method of quarantining and medication, so do your research and protect your tank. For everyone else, don't worry, it's very possible to have a successful reef tank without a quarantine system, and you're almost certainly in the majority of reefers out there. There are many other ways you can reduce the chances of introducing disease or parasites into the tank. First one being, be picky where you buy your fish from. Find a fish store you trust. The staff knows their stuff, it's clean, and they obviously care about the business and the health of the animals. Even better if they can show you the quarantine system they use prior to putting the fish on sale to you. In person, you can closely inspect the fish, which is the most important step to buying a healthy fish, and why buying online is such a gamble. If you buy fish online, it's much more important to have a proper quarantine system up and running because you don't know what you're getting. And if a fish does come slightly sick, most reefers don't have the heart to flush it, so they throw it in the tank anyways and risk the lives of the other fish in the tank, which is obviously a bad move. Another common method of preventing disease or parasite introduction is a few-minute freshwater dip before adding the fish to the tank. Most fish can tolerate fresh water for short periods of time, but many invertebrate can't, so they either die or fall right off the fish. In addition to this, many reefers will also medicate the dips as well. Make sure to do your research on how your specific fish tolerates fresh water or medications before dipping them. Beyond that, maintaining a stable reef tank with ample habitat, husbandry, and nutrition is one of the best ways to make sure your fish stay healthy. There's also equipment like UV sterilizers we covered in detail in week 14, which sterilize the water and reduce the pathogens and chances of an outbreak. Not a replacement for a quarantine, but a solid preventative measure for those with the space and budget. Most of you are familiar with acclimation. More or less, you're just replacing small amounts of water so the chemistry in the fish bag matches that of your tank and reduces stress. The easiest way to do this is throw the fish in a specimen container and hang it on a 5-gallon bucket and drip water from the tank into the container until you've changed over 3 to 4 times the water volume. Bigger fish you can do directly in the bucket. One really important element here is you don't want a single ounce of that water in your tank because you don't know if the online store or shop uses copper or other meds, and you don't want to add any of that water. So pour the fish out over a net or something suitable for your particular fish, over a sink or bucket, and then add only the fish to the tank. Last piece of this is you now have a new fish, so you have to feed it. We're going to do an in-depth episode on foods in the future, so on a super high level you can choose from dry options like flake and pellet, as well as frozen foods. Most reefers prefer pellets over flake because they sink rather than go down the overflow. A few of my favorite pellets are Coris, Elos, and mandarin. The thing about pellets is they're super convenient because you can store them right next to the tank, but they're also very nutrient dense, so a little goes a long way. You can pollute the tank pretty easily with foods like this, so be super careful about how much you add. This is particularly true with automatic feeders which dump the pellets in for you. It's super easy to add too much and pollute the tank. Automatic feeders are a great tool, especially for fish that need a stable, consistent source of food like anthias, or if you're out of town a lot, but beware they can ruin a tank just as easy by rapidly increasing nitrate and phosphate levels with extra food. Frozen foods are much less nutrient dense because they contain a lot of water, but they're often much more palatable and similar to a fish's natural food source than pellets. Because they're much less nutrient dense, it's much harder to overfeed and great for new reefers as well. Hawkfish mysis is probably one of the most popular options out there. So what did we select for the BRS 160? We decided to go with a handful of firefish we picked up at a local store I like a lot called Saltwater Empire because they freshwater dip almost everything that comes into the store, quarantine everything for a week in the back, and the systems are medicated. I know they care a lot about the animals and the reefers who come in there. We selected firefish as the first additions because they're a more timid species that do need some time to establish territory and feel comfortable in the tank. But when they do become comfortable, a small school of firefish is a really neat addition to any reef tank. It's been a couple days since we added them and they're still spending most of their time hiding in the rock, so you can see why we selected them as our first fish. The 6 firefish is more than you might typically add to a new tank, but we did a really solid job cycling the tank with the Red Sea Reef Mature Pro Kit. We have a ton of filtration media with the Marine Pure, and the Seni monitor we installed will give us real-time ammonia updates so we can treat the water if needed. And if we need to move any of the fish, I have 20 or so tanks here at BRS, so that's no problem. I know we're going to get blasted for this in the comments area for sure, but we're not going to quarantine the fish because they just don't have the space in the studio or available time to set up another tank and monitor it daily. I really strongly considered setting up a quarantine and moving the Seni over so I didn't have to monitor it as closely and do test kits every day. But open and honest, I've just seen more fish stress out and die in quarantine than I have seen disease outbreak in tanks. A lot of reefers feel otherwise, and based on their experiences, I say they're equally right. This hobby is really about 50% proven methods and about 50% personal experiences emulating your own and other reefers you trust successes. Between buying them from a store I trust who freshwater dips, quarantines, and medicates already, and the medicated dip I'm going to do here before addition, the giant oversized sterilizer rated for a tank 3 times as big as this one, and in the stable, healthy system we're putting them in, I think we've done our due diligence at protecting the tank. This tank is officially live now. We have our first batch of fish. Next week we're going to talk evaporation and auto top-off solutions. After that, protein skimmers, and then 5 weeks of lighting. You don't want to miss any of this, so hit that subscribe button. If you're interested in learning more about any of the products that we talked about today, check out this link. See you next week with episode 16 of the BRS 160 Auto Top-Offs.